At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood as the most powerful political entity the world had ever known. It stretched across continents, oceans, and cultures, ruling over nearly a quarter of the planet's land and population. From the bustling ports of India to the deserts of Africa, from Caribbean sugar islands to Pacific trade routes, Britain's flag flew almost everywhere the sun touched. This unprecedented dominance did not rely solely on military conquest. Instead, it was sustained through administration, trade, diplomacy, and an elaborate system of global influence. London became the beating heart of the world economy. The pound sterling functioned as a global currency, British banks financed international trade, and British shipping lanes connected distant colonies into one vast imperial network. The empire did not merely conquer territory, it managed it. Civil servants, governors, and colonial officers maintained control through laws, taxation systems, and indirect rule, often governing millions with surprisingly few British personnel on the ground. Yet beneath this appearance of absolute strength lay deep contradictions. The empire was vast, but it was also fragile. Its power depended on economic stability, political legitimacy, and cooperation from local elites. Any disruption, financial crisis, war, or mass resistance, could strain the entire system. And as the 20th century progressed, those disruptions began arriving faster than Britain could contain them. The First World War marked the beginning of a subtle but irreversible shift. Britain emerged on the winning side, but victory came at an enormous cost. Millions were dead, the national debt had exploded, and the illusion of imperial invincibility had been shattered. Colonies that had supplied troops, resources, and labor now demanded political recognition in return. For the first time, the empire was being questioned not just by its subjects, but by Britain itself. Still, the empire expanded on paper. After the war, Britain took control of former Ottoman and German territories under League of Nations mandates. Maps showed an empire larger than ever, but reality told a different story. Maintaining these territories required money Britain no longer had and authority it could no longer unquestioningly command. The machinery of empire was running on momentum, not strength. The Second World War delivered the decisive blow, but not in the way most people expect. Britain did not lose its empire through battlefield defeat by colonial rebels. Instead, it was economically exhausted. Cities lay in ruins, industries were crippled, and the country depended heavily on American loans to survive. The war proved one thing beyond doubt: Britain could no longer afford to rule the world. Meanwhile, global attitudes had changed. Anti-colonial ideas spread rapidly, inspired by principles of self-determination and freedom. Colonial soldiers who fought fascism abroad returned home questioning why those same freedoms did not apply to them. The moral authority of empire had evaporated. The turning point came in India. Often called the jewel in the crown, India was central to Britain's imperial identity and economy. Yet by the 1940s, governing India had become politically impossible. Mass movements, economic pressure, and international scrutiny made continued control untenable. In 1947, Britain withdrew, not after a decisive war, but through negotiation and urgency. Independence arrived quickly, and with it, the realization that the empire's foundation was crumbling. What followed was not collapse, but retreat. Britain adjusted its foreign policy quietly, reframing withdrawal as partnership. Former colonies were granted independence one after another, often through carefully managed transitions designed to preserve British influence. This strategy would later be formalized through the Commonwealth of Nations, a diplomatic network that replaced direct rule with cooperation. Nowhere was Britain's declining authority more exposed than during the Suez Crisis. When Britain attempted to assert control over the Suez Canal without U.S. support, it was forced into humiliating withdrawal. The message was clear: Britain was no longer a global enforcer. Power had shifted, and the empire could not survive in a world where Britain was no longer the dominant player. Crucially, Britain did not resist this reality with massive wars of repression. Instead, it adapted. Colonial offices were replaced with foreign ministries. Governors became ambassadors. Flags were lowered, but trade agreements remained. Military bases closed, yet intelligence ties endured. Britain chose influence over ownership, diplomacy over domination. This quiet transformation reshaped global politics. While other empires collapsed violently, Britain managed a relatively orderly exit. The narrative of decline was carefully controlled, presented not as defeat, but as evolution. Britain had not lost its empire, the story went, it had modernized, but was this really a peaceful withdrawal? Or was it simply a strategic retreat masked as moral progress? We will examine how Britain engineered independence across Africa and the Middle East, often leaving behind borders, institutions, and conflicts that continue to shape the modern world. The empire may have vanished from maps, but its legacy remains deeply embedded in global politics. By the late 1940s, the British Empire had reached a critical crossroads. India was gone, Britain was financially exhausted, and the global political climate had turned decisively against colonial rule. Yet despite this apparent decline, Britain still controlled vast territories across Africa and the Middle East. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a carefully managed withdrawal, one designed to protect British interests long after the flags were lowered. Africa became the central testing ground for Britain's new imperial strategy. Unlike India, African colonies were less industrialized, more fragmented, and ruled largely through indirect systems that relied on local chiefs and elites. British policymakers believed this would allow for a slower, more controlled transition. Independence, they argued, would come, but only when colonies were ready. In reality, readiness was defined by Britain's economic and strategic needs. The Gold Coast, later renamed Ghana, was the first major African colony to gain independence in 1957. Britain presented this as proof that decolonization could be peaceful and cooperative. Ceremonies were televised, speeches praised partnership, and the transition appeared smooth. But Ghana was an exception, not the rule. It was economically viable, politically organized, and strategically useful as a showcase. Elsewhere, the story was far more complex. In Kenya, British authority was challenged by the Mau Mau uprising. Although Britain publicly framed its empire as retreating peacefully, it responded to resistance with brutal counterinsurgency campaigns. Detention camps, collective punishment, and mass arrests exposed the contradiction at the heart of Britain's narrative. Independence was granted in 1963, but only after British control had been violently reasserted. The war was not acknowledged as such, allowing Britain to maintain the illusion that it had not lost the colony through conflict. Across Africa, borders drawn by colonial administrators remained untouched. These lines, often arbitrary, ignored ethnic, linguistic, and religious realities. Britain chose administrative convenience over long-term stability. The priority was speed and control, not cohesion. The consequences of these decisions would echo for generations, fueling internal conflicts that Britain would later describe as local problems, detached from their colonial origins. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Britain faced a different challenge altogether. The region had been reshaped after the First World War, when Britain acquired former Ottoman territories under League of Nations mandates. These lands were never intended to become permanent colonies. They were meant to be managed, stabilized, and eventually released, but always in a way that safeguarded British strategic interests, particularly oil and trade routes. Nowhere was this strategy more evident than in Palestine. Tasked with governing a land claimed by both Arabs and Jews, Britain found itself trapped between incompatible promises. As violence escalated in the 1940s, British authorities chose withdrawal over resolution. In 1948, Britain handed the problem to the United Nations and exited the territory. What followed was not peace, but one of the most enduring conflicts in modern history. Britain had left without a war, but not without consequences. In Egypt, British influence lingered long after formal independence. Control over the Suez Canal ensured that Britain retained leverage, until it didn't. The Suez Crisis revealed the limits of Britain's post-imperial power, forcing a rapid reassessment of its Middle Eastern role. From that moment on, Britain shifted from ruler to partner, aligning its foreign policy closely with the United States. This realignment marked a critical shift. Britain no longer sought to dominate regions directly. Instead, it focused on maintaining influence through military bases, intelligence cooperation, economic ties, and political alliances. Former colonies were encouraged to remain within British-led networks, trading sovereignty for stability and support. The Commonwealth of Nations became the centerpiece of this approach. It offered continuity without control, a way to preserve cultural and economic connections without the costs of empire. Independence ceremonies were grand, but Britain ensured that legal systems, financial institutions, and military training programs remained closely aligned with British models. This strategy allowed Britain to claim moral high ground. Unlike other empires, it argued, Britain had chosen to leave. But this narrative ignored the pressures that made withdrawal inevitable: nationalist movements, global opinion, economic decline, and the rise of new superpowers. By the late 1960s, the British Empire in Africa and the Middle East had effectively ended. Dozens of new nations emerged, their flags replacing the Union Jack. Yet Britain's presence did not disappear, it transformed. Advisors replaced governors. Treaties replaced decrees. Influence replaced authority. This was not decolonization as surrender. It was decolonization as adaptation. Britain had learned a crucial lesson: controlling territory was less important than shaping outcomes. By exiting quietly, Britain avoided the humiliation of military defeat and preserved its status as a global diplomatic player. The empire was gone, but Britain was still at the table. By the early 1970s, the British Empire had effectively disappeared from the map. The vast territories once shaded in imperial red were now independent nations with their own flags, governments, and identities. Yet Britain itself had not vanished into irrelevance. Instead, it underwent one of the most remarkable political transformations in modern history: the conversion of territorial empire into invisible power. The loss of empire forced Britain to confront a difficult reality. It could no longer dominate through military presence or colonial administration. Its economy, weakened by war and decolonization, could not support global policing. But Britain possessed something few former empires did: institutions that could adapt. Rather than clinging to fading authority, Britain redefined what power meant in a post-imperial world. At the center of this reinvention stood London. Long before the empire fell, London had been a financial hub. After empire, it became Britain's primary source of global relevance. The City of London transformed itself into an international financial marketplace, attracting capital from former colonies, emerging economies, and global corporations. Money replaced territory as the foundation of British influence. This financial reinvention was not accidental. Britain deliberately deregulated markets, embraced offshore banking, and positioned itself as a neutral ground for global capital. Former colonies, newly independent but economically fragile, often relied on British banks, legal systems, and financial expertise. The empire no longer ruled them, but it still shaped how they interacted with the global economy. Parallel to this financial shift was Britain's continued dominance in law and governance. English common law became the legal backbone of countless nations. Contracts, trade agreements, and international disputes were frequently resolved in British courts. Legal continuity ensured that British norms remained embedded in global systems long after political control ended. Then there was intelligence. Organizations like MI6 and GCHQ quietly replaced colonial administrators as tools of influence. During the Cold War, Britain positioned itself as a critical intelligence partner to the United States. Though no longer a superpower, Britain was a gatekeeper of information, networks, and historical knowledge of regions it once ruled. This partnership was formalized through alliances such as NATO, which allowed Britain to maintain global military relevance without imperial responsibilities. British forces no longer occupied colonies, they participated in multinational coalitions. Influence now flowed through cooperation rather than command. Culturally, Britain retained enormous soft power. The English language became the default medium of global business, diplomacy, and science. British universities attracted elites from across the former empire, educating future leaders who would carry British perspectives back to their home countries. Media institutions like the BBC shaped global narratives, presenting Britain as stable, authoritative, and trustworthy. The Commonwealth of Nations served as the symbolic bridge between past and present. Though officially voluntary and equal, it preserved cultural ties that subtly reinforced British leadership. Shared sporting events, educational exchanges, and diplomatic forums kept Britain at the center of a network it no longer ruled but still influenced, yet reinvention came at a psychological cost. For decades, British identity had been built on empire. Its loss created uncertainty and nostalgia. Political debates oscillated between embracing a European future and reclaiming a global role rooted in imperial memory. This tension would resurface dramatically in the 21st century, as Britain once again questioned its place in the world. Crucially, Britain's quiet retreat allowed it to avoid the reckoning faced by other empires. There was no single moment of collapse, no definitive defeat. As a result, imperial history was often softened, reframed as administration rather than domination. The absence of a dramatic end made it easier to forget the violence, exploitation, and inequality that sustained the empire for centuries, but the legacy remains. Borders drawn in London continue to define nations. Economic systems designed for extraction still shape global inequalities. Political institutions transplanted during colonial rule persist, sometimes stabilizing, sometimes destabilizing. Britain may have exited the stage quietly, but its script is still being performed around the world. In the modern era, Britain presents itself as a champion of rules-based order, diplomacy, and cooperation. These values are real, but they are also the inheritors of imperial logic. The difference is not in influence, but in method. The story of how Britain lost its empire without a single war is not a tale of moral awakening. It is a lesson in adaptation. When direct control became too costly, Britain chose something far more sustainable: networks, norms, and narratives. Empires no longer need flags or governors. They operate through finance, culture, intelligence, and law. Britain understood this before most, and acted accordingly. The empire ended not with a bang, but with a strategy, and that may be its most enduring legacy of all. Every empire leaves behind ruins, but some also leave behind stories. For Britain, the most enduring legacy of decolonization may not be the borders it drew or the institutions it built, but the narrative it crafted about how its empire ended. The dominant story is simple and comforting. Britain recognized the changing world, chose morality over force, and peacefully handed independence to its colonies. Compared to other empires, it claims, Britain exited responsibly. This story is repeated in textbooks, political speeches, and popular culture. It frames the end of empire as an act of wisdom rather than necessity, of generosity rather than pressure. But when examined closely, this narrative begins to fracture. The truth is more complicated, and far less comfortable. Britain did not abandon empire because it suddenly rejected imperialism. It withdrew because the costs of maintaining control had become unbearable. Economic exhaustion after 2 world wars, mounting resistance movements, and intense international scrutiny left Britain with limited options. The choice was not between empire and morality, it was between adaptation and collapse. To preserve its global standing, Britain reframed retreat as reform. This reframing depended on silence. Conflicts were minimized, violence was obscured, and responsibility was deflected. In India, independence arrived quickly, but so did partition. The hurried British withdrawal left behind a fractured subcontinent, triggering one of the largest mass migrations in human history. Over 1 million people died. Yet in Britain, partition was long described as an unfortunate but unavoidable outcome of ancient tensions, rather than the result of rushed imperial decisions. A similar pattern emerged elsewhere. In Africa, Britain emphasized ceremonies and constitutions while downplaying repression. The detention camps of Kenya, the suppression of uprisings, and the manipulation of ethnic divisions were largely absent from official narratives. Independence was presented as a gift bestowed, not a demand fought for. By controlling the language of decolonization, Britain controlled how history would remember it. In the Middle East, silence was even more consequential. The British withdrawal from Palestine was framed as a neutral exit from an intractable problem. In reality, Britain left behind unresolved promises, armed groups, and a power vacuum that exploded into war almost immediately. Millions were displaced. Decades of conflict followed. Britain did not fire the final shot, but its decisions set the stage. These outcomes raise an uncomfortable question: can an exit be called peaceful if it leaves behind violence? Britain's answer has often been yes, by redefining peace as the absence of British troops, not the presence of stability. This distinction allowed Britain to distance itself from the consequences of decolonization. Once the flag came down, responsibility was seen as transferred. Even if the structures that caused instability remained, the Commonwealth of Nations played a critical role in sustaining this moral narrative. It symbolized continuity without coercion, friendship without force. But beneath its rhetoric of equality lay asymmetries of power. Britain retained economic, cultural, and diplomatic advantages, while former colonies navigated independence with institutions designed for imperial administration, not self-rule. Education systems further reinforced selective memory. Imperial history was often taught as exploration and governance rather than exploitation and resistance. Generations grew up knowing the empire ended, but not fully understanding how it functioned, or who paid the price for its longevity. This selective memory has consequences today. Debates over immigration, national identity, and foreign policy are shaped by unresolved imperial nostalgia. Calls to return to global greatness often echo a past that is only partially remembered. Without a full reckoning, empire becomes myth, invoked but not examined. Meanwhile, former colonies continue to live with imperial legacies. Borders that split communities. Economies structured around extraction. Political systems that centralized power in ways that encouraged authoritarianism. These are not accidents of post-colonial failure, they are inheritances, yet Britain's quiet exit has shielded it from accountability. Unlike empires that fell in flames, Britain slipped away in stages. There was no single moment demanding national reflection, no definitive reckoning. The empire dissolved gradually enough to be normalized and forgotten, but forgetting is not the same as resolution. In recent years, demands for historical honesty have grown louder. Statues are questioned. Archives are opened. Survivors speak. The myth of benevolent withdrawal is increasingly challenged by evidence long ignored. Britain's imperial past is no longer a closed chapter, it is an ongoing conversation. Understanding how Britain lost its empire without a single war requires rejecting the simplicity of the official story. It means recognizing that power does not disappear when armies leave. It transforms. It hides. It persists. The empire ended quietly, but its echoes are loud, and until those echoes are confronted honestly, the story remains unfinished. Empires rarely announce their endings. They fade, transform, and rename themselves. By the late 20th century, the British Empire had vanished from atlases, yet its departure offered a blueprint for how power could survive without territory. Britain's quiet exit did not mark the end of empire as a concept, it marked its modernization. To understand why this matters now, we must first abandon the idea that empires require colonies. In the modern world, power flows through finance, law, culture, technology, and security partnerships. Britain grasped this earlier than most. When direct rule became unsustainable, it shifted to shaping systems rather than governing people. The first lesson is economic. Britain replaced land with leverage. As global markets expanded, control over currency exchange, insurance, shipping law, and banking proved more influential than possession of territory. The City of London became a crossroads where global capital converged. Former colonies, still navigating fragile post-independence economies, often relied on British financial infrastructure. This dependence created continuity without command. The second lesson is legal. British-designed institutions, courts, civil services, and administrative frameworks outlived the empire. English common law became the operating system of global commerce. Contracts written in English and adjudicated under British legal principles ensured predictability for investors and governments alike. This legal continuity embedded British norms into the machinery of globalization. The third lesson is cultural. Language, education, and media can travel where armies cannot. English became the world's lingua franca. British universities trained elites from across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Graduates returned home fluent not just in a language, but in assumptions about governance, economics, and international order. Soft power proved quieter and more durable than coercion. Security followed the same pattern. Britain no longer policed colonies, it participated in alliances. Through organizations like NATO, Britain amplified its influence by aligning with larger powers while offering expertise, intelligence, and diplomatic reach. Its role shifted from commander to broker, connecting regions it once ruled to a new global order. At the symbolic center of this transformation stood the Commonwealth of Nations. Presented as voluntary and egalitarian, it maintained networks of cooperation in trade, education, and diplomacy. While many members benefited, the arrangement also preserved British centrality. The empire's architecture remained, only the language changed. These strategies raise a challenging question: if power persists without colonies, has empire truly ended, or merely evolved? Britain's experience suggests the latter. The absence of formal domination does not equal the absence of influence. Borders drawn under colonial rule continue to define politics. Economic pathways designed for extraction still shape development. International norms born in imperial contexts continue to govern global behavior. Empire did not disappear, it dissolved into systems. This realization reframes Britain's peaceful exit. The lack of a single, decisive war spared Britain the trauma of defeat, and spared it a reckoning. Without a dramatic collapse, imperial history could be softened, compartmentalized, and postponed. Memory became selective. Accountability became diffuse, yet the consequences of that exit were not abstract. Communities were divided by hurried borders. Conflicts ignited by unresolved promises. States inherited institutions unsuited to inclusive governance. Britain may have left quietly, but others lived loudly with the aftermath. Why does this history matter today? Because the methods Britain pioneered are now common. Powerful states and corporations shape outcomes without annexation. Influence is exerted through supply chains, standards, sanctions, data, and debt. Intervention is framed as partnership. Control is exercised through access rather than occupation. The language is new, the logic is familiar. Understanding Britain's exit helps us recognize modern power for what it is. It teaches us to look beyond flags and bases, to follow money, norms, and narratives. It warns us that peaceful transitions can still produce violence, and that responsibility does not end when authority is formally relinquished. It also offers a sober reminder about storytelling. Nations curate their pasts to serve their presents. Britain's narrative of benevolent withdrawal supported a post-imperial identity as a champion of rules and restraint. That identity contains truth, but also omission. A fuller history does not diminish Britain, it clarifies it. Reckoning is not about blame alone. It is about understanding how choices echo. When archives open and histories broaden, they reveal not just what Britain did, but how systems endure. Such understanding is essential if future transitions, from dominance to cooperation, are to be more just than those that came before. The British Empire ended without a single war that marked its death. But its life did not end there. It changed form. It changed vocabulary. It embedded itself in the structures of a globalized world.